The clerk in Cobray, in the Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1888, had a stack of worthless deeds he wanted off his desk before noon, and he sold the last of them to a woman who had walked in out of the dust with $1 folded flat in her glove. The deed she bought was for a mine called the Lucky Strike, a hole punched into the shoulder of a ridge 11 miles north, a mine that had caved in 7 years before and killed the man who owned it and had not been worked since. The clerk laughed when she signed her name. He told her she had bought herself a grave with a door on it. She thanked him, folded the paper into her satchel, and walked back out into the light. And she did not tell him what she already suspected, which was that somewhere down in that collapsed dark, there was a name cut into the rock that someone had paid a great deal of money to bury. Her name was Della Hart, and she was 29 years old, and she had come to that town with almost nothing, because almost nothing was what had been left to her. What she carried that the clerk could not see was a way of reading stone. Her father had been a timberman and a shoring man in the deep mines of the Comstock before his lungs gave out, and he had taught her in the slow, patient years of his dying how a mountain talks before it falls, how to read a crack the way a doctor reads a pulse, how to tell rotten ground from sound ground by the sound a hammer made against it. He had no son, and he had decided early that the lack of one would not mean the lack of an heir to what he knew. And so he had carried her down into the workings when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders, and had named for her every part of the dark. He taught her the squeeze of bad ground, and the patience of good timber, and the way fear travels up a rope. He taught her never to trust a roof she had not tapped, and never to set a post she had not capped, and never, above all, to let another man's hurry become her own. He had taught her one thing above all the rest, repeated so often it had become the shape of her thinking. Listen to the ground first. The ground does not lie, even when men do. She had not bought the Lucky Strike for the gold. There was no gold in it worth the speaking of, and everyone in Cobray knew it. She had bought it because of a letter, and because of a man named Eli Mercer who had died in it, and because the story she had been told about how he died did not match the only thing she had left of him. Stay with me, because what she found in that shaft was not what she went looking for, and it changed more than her own small fortune. That comes later. First, there is the matter of how she came to own a dead man's grave for the price of a meal. Eli Mercer had been her father's friend, the last of them, a quiet prospector who had struck a thin vein of gold on that ridge in the spring of 1879 and worked it alone for 2 years. Della had met him only twice, both times when he came down to Virginia City to sit with her father at the end, 2 old mining men talking low about ground and ore, and the men who cheated them. She remembered him as a spare, weathered man with a habit of stillness, who listened more than he spoke and who looked at a thing a long while before he touched it. The same habit her father had drilled into her. The 2 of them would sit by her father's bed until the lamp guttered, not saying much, the silence between old friends who had nothing left to prove to one another. When her father died, Eli had pressed a folded paper into her hand and told her if anything ever came of the Lucky Strike, it was half hers, and that he had written it down proper. Then he had gone back up the ridge, and a year later the word came down that the mine had caved and Eli with it, and that was the end of it. The end of it, except that the paper Eli had given her was not a sentimental note. It was a partnership agreement, signed and dated, witnessed by a man whose name she did not know, granting Della a half interest in the Lucky Strike and all its workings. And 6 months after Eli died, a letter had come to her in another woman's hand, a woman who signed herself only as a friend, saying that Eli Mercer had not died the way the town said, that the cave-in had come the same week a man named Royce Calloway had tried to buy the mine and been refused, and that Eli had told this friend before he died that if the mountain ever took him, she should write to the timberman's daughter and tell her to look at the ground herself. Royce Calloway owned the smelter in Cobra and the freight line and the bank that held most of the paper in the valley. He was a man who did his work through documents. He had bought up half the failed claims on the ridge after the Lucky Strike caved, consolidated them under a single grant, and run a profitable low operation out of the tailings for 7 years, taking a steady margin off ground that other men had broken themselves on. He was polite. He gave to the church and stood at the front of it on Sundays, and he was known for the soft, reasonable voice in which he explained to a man why the man's claim was worth less than the man had hoped and why Calloway was doing him a kindness to take it off his hands. He never raised that voice. He never needed to. When Della came to register her deed, his clerk had been the one to laugh, and she understood from the laugh that the name Mercer still meant something in that office, and that whatever it meant, it was not grief. She rode out to the ridge the next morning on a borrowed mule with a satchel of her father's tools. 11 miles of climbing track that the freight wagons had long since stopped running. The road grown over and washed in places until it was little more than a memory of a road. She saw the mine for the first time near midday, and for a long while she only stood and looked at it. The mouth of the Lucky Strike was a ragged black throat in the hillside, half choked with fallen timber and broken rock, the headframe above it leaning like a drunk, the ore chute rotted to lace, the iron of the rails gone to red scale. Cheatgrass had grown up through the ties. A pack rat had built its nest in the cracked windlass drum. A man had died in there, and no one had brought him out, and the mountain had simply closed over him the way water closes over a stone. She tied the mule in the shade of a juniper and walked up to the mouth and put her bare hand flat against the cold rock at the entrance. And she listened, the way her father had taught her with her palm and not her ear, feeling for the faint life of a mountain. The way sound ground answers a touch with a kind of settled patience, and bad ground answers with nothing at all. The ground did not lie. And what it told her, standing there in the first hour, was that the Lucky Strike had not fallen the way a mine falls when a mountain decides to take it back. She made her camp at the mouth, and she did not go in for 3 days. This is the part the people in town would never have understood, the part that made them sure she was a fool. She did not rush into the dark to dig for gold. She sat outside the collapsed shaft and she studied it, the way her father had taught her to study a thing before laying a hand on it. Because the first mistake in bad ground is the one that kills you. She walked the hillside above the mine and read the way the surface had settled, the long, shallow dish in the cheatgrass where the ground had subsided over the fall, and she paced it off and found it shorter than a natural collapse would carry. The failure stopped clean where someone had wanted it to stop. She watched the mouth at dawn and again at dusk to see whether it breathed, whether the air moved in or out with the changing heat. Because a mine that still breathes still has a passage open somewhere in the dark, and the Lucky Strike breathed faintly. A cold exhalation at evening that smelled of stone and old timber, and something fainter under it that she did not name. She cleared the loose rubble from the entrance by hand, one stone at a time, setting each aside in an order she could remember. And as she cleared it, she read each timber she uncovered, and the timbers told her a story she did not want to be true. A mine caves for reasons, and the reasons are written in the wood and the rock. When a mountain fails on its own, it fails along its weakness, the timbers crushed and splintered by the slow, enormous weight of stone settling where the rock was always going to give. Della had seen such failures. Her father had drawn them for her in the dirt with a stick. The way the load travels and the way the wood gives. The long splinters that bloom from a post when 10,000 tons decide to come down on it. He had made her name the parts of a failure before he would let her name anything else, because a person who cannot read a healthy ruin cannot read a poisoned one. The timbers she pulled from the mouth of the Lucky Strike were not crushed. They were cut. 3 of the main supports near the entrance had been sawn most of the way through and then snapped, the saw kerf still clean and square in the old wood, the teeth marks running straight across the grain where no settling stone would ever have left them, sheltered from the weather by the rubble that had buried it. She ran her thumb along one of the cuts, and it was as smooth as a sawn plank, and the broken portion above it was ragged where the weakened post had finally torn under a load it should have carried for a century. Someone had walked into that mine with a saw and weakened it on purpose, and then brought it down, and they had done it cleverly near the mouth where the collapse would look like a natural failure spreading inward. The kind of failure a coroner content with the easy answer would write down as the mountain taking back its own. She sat with that knowledge through a cold night, the cut timber across her knees, and she did not weep, because weeping was not a tool that opened anything. She turned the post over in her hands in the firelight and read the saw marks again and again until she could have drawn them with her eyes shut, and she made herself a quiet promise that she would bring out everything the mountain held, the body and the proof and the name, whatever it cost her in months and in labor. In the morning she began to dig in earnest, and now her digging had a purpose beyond the gold. Eli Mercer was somewhere in that dark, and the truth of how he died was down there with him, and she meant to bring out both. She rationed her stores against a long stay and set a tally stick by the fire to count the days, and she began the slow undoing of the catastrophe at the one place a person can begin, which is the mouth. And she did not let herself think past the next 10 feet of ground, because a thing this large is only ever done in lengths a body can manage. I will tell you that she was alone in this, and that being alone was the hardest part, harder than the rock. Yet she was not entirely without help, and the help came from a quarter she did not expect. His name was Asa Webb, and he was an old man who lived in a stone hut at the foot of the ridge and had once been a powder man, the one who set the charges in the deep mines before his hands began to shake. He came up the trail on the 4th day, drawn by the sound of her work, and he stood at a distance watching her clear the entrance, and at last he spoke. He told her she was wasting her life on a dead hole. She kept working. He told her the Lucky Strike had killed a good man and would kill her too. She kept working. Then she stopped and turned and showed him the cut timber, the clean square kerf of the saw in the old wood, and she watched the old man's face change, and she knew that he had suspected something for 7 years and had been afraid to say it to anyone. Asa Webb sat down on a rock and was quiet for a long time. His hands lay open on his knees, and she saw that they trembled, a fine, constant tremor that no amount of stillness could quiet, the legacy of a lifetime of holding fuse and cap and watching the burning thread run down toward the powder. Then he told her what he had never told the town. He had been hired a week before the cave-in to look at the Lucky Strike by a man who worked for Royce Calloway, and he had walked the ground and tapped the back and read the timbers, and he had told that man the truth, that the ground was sound and the mine was good, and there was no reason it should fail. 3 days later, it failed. He had said nothing in the 7 years since, because he was old and poor, and Calloway owned the valley, and because saying a thing you cannot prove is a good way to end up under your own roof. A man my age, he told her, learns to swallow what he cannot chew, and I have swallowed this one a long while. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man confessing not to her, but to the years. He had not forgotten. And now here was a timberman's daughter with a saw kerf in her hand, and the old fear in him turned slowly into something steadier, the way cold iron under a steady fire turns at last to something that will hold an edge. He did not offer to help with words. He simply came back the next morning with his own tools and a coil of good rope and a habit of work that 30 years underground had ground into him. And from that day they labored together, the young woman who could read stone and the old man who knew how the dark behaved. She set the shoring and he cleared the muck, and where the ground was treacherous she went first because she could hear it, and where a thing needed lifting that was past her strength, he found the angle and the lever that made it possible. They worked from first light to last, and the shaft gave way to them 1 foot at a time, and every foot was bought with labor and with care, because the mountain that had been made to fall once could be made to fall again, and they both knew it. The work was slow in a way that town people cannot imagine. To open a collapsed shaft is not to dig a hole. It is to take the mountain apart in reverse, to undo a catastrophe stone by stone while holding up everything above it. Della shored as she went, setting new timber under the old failed ground, squaring each post and capping it, and driving the wedges home until the wood took the load and sang faintly under it, reading every crack before she trusted her weight to it, tapping the rock with her hammer and listening to the answer. Sound rock rang, a high, clean note that carried down the timber and into her wrist. Rotten rock thudded dull and dead, and where she heard that deadness she did not dig until she had set a post beneath it. She learned the voice of that particular mountain, the way you learn the moods of a person you live beside, the places where it grumbled in the early cold, and the places where it held its peace. And the mountain learned that she would not be hurried, and between them they came to an understanding that let her live. There were setbacks that cost them days. A face they had cleared came down again one night while they slept at the mouth, the muffled cough of it waking them in the dark. And in the morning they found a week of work undone and began again without complaint, because the mountain that had been made to fall once could not be expected to fall gently the second time. Della's hands cracked and bled, and she bound them and went on. Asa's tremor steadied oddly when he was at the work, as though the hands that shook at rest remembered their old surety the moment they closed on a tool. A week in, the muck they cleared began to change. At first it had been broken country rock and shattered timber, the rubble of the entrance collapse. Now they reached the place where the working tunnel had been, and here the fall was different, deeper, the original deliberate failure. And here Della had to be most careful of all. She found Eli Mercer's tools first, scattered where he had dropped them, a single jack hammer and a set of steel drills, and a candle holder with a stub of candle still in it. And she set them aside with a gentleness she did not show the rock. A man had been working with these when the mountain came down on him. She knew now it had not been the mountain's own choice. They found him on the 11th day. He was where the tunnel had been narrowest, caught under a fall of rock near the back of the worked-out stope, and there was not much left after 7 years, but bone and boot leather and the rusted buckle of his belt. But it was enough. Della stopped the work when they reached him. She had known, since the first morning she put her hand to the cold rock, that she would come to this, and the knowing had not made it lighter. She and Asa Webb cleared the stone from him by hand, slowly, lifting each piece away, rather than levering it, the way you would uncover something sleeping you did not wish to wake. They gathered what there was of Eli Mercer into a length of clean canvas, and the old man took off his hat, and the young woman stood with her father's friend in her arms in the dark, 11 miles from anyone, and the only light was the lamp she had set on the rock. And for a moment the labor stopped, and only the grief remained. Asa said the words he half remembered from 100 miners' burials, and his voice did not shake though his hands did. Then she wrapped him and they carried him out to the light and laid him in the shade of the juniper, and she covered him, and she went back in. There was more in the mountain than a body. There was the reason. Have you ever known a thing in your bones that you could not prove, and had to do the long work of dragging the proof up into the light by hand? Tell me if you have. That was the work Della had given herself, and the proof was waiting deeper in the dark. Past the place where they found Eli, the tunnel opened into the stope where he had been mining the vein, and here the deliberate nature of the fall showed itself plainly to anyone who could read ground. The roof had been brought down by charges, not by failure. Asa Webb, who had been a powder man for 30 years, found the evidence and didn't have to be told what it was. In the back wall of the stope, half buried, was a section of rock that had been drilled for blasting, the drill holes still visible, the round, clean bores of a hand steel, driven in a pattern he knew the way a man knows his own signature. Holes that had no business being where they were, in a part of the mine where no ore ran, and no working called for them. A man drills for ore, or he drills for advance, and these holes pointed at neither. They were aimed at the roof. Asa knelt by them a long while, working a thin twig of juniper into one of the bores to gauge its depth and angle, and he muttered the arithmetic of it under his breath, the depth and the spacing and the lift such a pattern would throw, the calculation of a lifetime spent making mountains move on command. When he stood, his voice was different. He said he had set 10,000 charges in his life, and he knew the work of a coward when he saw it, a man who would not face another man, but would drill his roof in the dark and let the mountain do his killing for him, and he would swear to these holes before any man who asked, and let Calloway send what he liked after. The holes alone were not the whole of it, and the whole of it was the thing the letter had promised, the thing about the name carved deep in the shaft. Della found it on the 17th day, working alone while Asa rested his hands, deep in the stope past the blast holes, where the original wall of Eli Mercer's working still stood. It was the custom of a man working a claim alone to mark his progress and his ground, to cut the date and the assay into the rock as he went, a record kept in stone because stone outlasts paper, and paper can be burned. Eli had kept such a record. She had been finding it for days as she advanced, the small, neat cuttings of a careful man, the dates and the depths and the run of the vein, a working journal written into the wall itself, in a hand that grew, she noticed, more deliberate as it neared the end, as though the man who cut it had begun to take more care with each letter. And in the last of it, in the deepest part of the stope, where he had been working in the final week of his life, he had cut more than a date. He had cut a message, and he had cut it deep, the way a man cuts a thing he means to survive him, the strokes driven a full half-inch into the hard rock, the work of hours stolen from a dying claim. She brushed the rock dust from it with her hand and held the lamp close and read it, and the cold of the sealed mountain seemed to gather around her as she read. He had carved his own name, Eli Mercer, and the date, and below it, in letters driven hard into the stone, he had cut the words that he had not lived to speak aloud. Calloway means to take this ground by paper or by powder. If I am found here, look to him. The vein is true. I'll leave my half to the timberman's girl. He had known. In the last week of his life, refusing to sell, he had understood what was coming, and he had done the only thing a man alone in a mountain could do. He had written his accusation and his will into the one ledger that could not be falsified, the living rock itself. And he had cut it deep enough to last, and then he had gone on working, and the mountain had come down on him as he feared it would. And for 7 years the words had waited in the dark for a hand that could reach them. Della Hart sat before the carved stone for a long while in the lamplight. She did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of a man's last hours, the patience of his cutting, the steadiness of a hand that knew it might be the last thing it ever did and chose to spend itself on the truth. She traced the letters with her finger. The vein is true. I leave my half to the timberman's girl. He had named her. Across 7 years and through 11 feet of fallen rock, the dead man had reached out and named her, and given her not only his ground, but his trust, and the work of finishing what he had started. This is the moment to tell you that she did not take the carved stone and ride into Cobra and stand in the street and shout the name of Royce Calloway. That was never her way, and it was never the way the truth does its surest work. The truth is not a gun. It is a weight. And a weight does its work by being set down in the right place, slowly, where it cannot be lifted again. She brought up the proof with the care of a woman who knew that proof can be lost. She made a careful drawing of the carved stone and its words, copying each letter as it stood in the rock, and beneath the drawing she wrote down the depth and bearing of it from the mouth so that any man could find the place, and Asa Webb signed it as witness to what he had seen with his own eyes in its place in the mountain. She brought out the cut timbers, the 3 sawn posts with their clean square kerfs, and kept them wrapped in canvas like the relics they were. She brought out the record of the drilled blast holes in the old man's hand, and her own, the pattern sketched and the depths noted. She left the carved wall itself where it stood, because the strongest evidence is the kind a man cannot carry off, the kind that waits in the ground for the doubter to come and put his own hand on it. And then, with Eli's body and her father's tools, and the dead man's accusation cut into stone behind her, she rode down off the ridge, and she did not go to Calloway. She went to the county seat at Solano, 2 days east over the pass where Royce Calloway did not own the bank or the smelter or the men, and she laid the whole of it before the territorial recorder and the mining commissioner who had no reason to love a Cobre smelter man, and several reasons of old rivalry not to. The commissioner was a dry, careful man named Pell who had spent his life among claims and the lies told over them, and he did not warm to her, and she did not ask him to. She set her evidence on his table in the order a thing must be understood, and she let it speak. The deed for $1, the witness partnership agreement 7 years old, the letter in the unknown woman's hand, the drawing of the carved wall, the sawn timbers, the old powder man waiting in the hall with his shaking hands and his steady account. Pell listened and asked his questions, and the questions were the questions of a man looking for the hole in a story, and he did not find one because there was none to find. The ground had not lied, and neither did she. And a true thing laid out in order has a weight that a careful man feels even against his own inclination. It took longer than a gunshot. Justice of the kind she sought always does, yet the carved stone could not be argued with, and the cut timbers could not be explained away. And Asa Webb stood before the commissioner with his 30 years and his shaking hands and his testimony about drill holes where no ore ran, and the partnership agreement Eli had pressed into her hand 7 years before, witnessed and dated, gave Della the standing to bring the whole of it. The recorder sent men to the Lucky Strike to see the carved wall for themselves, and they saw it, and what they saw could not be unseen. Royce Calloway was never met in a courtroom by the woman who had bought his secret for $1, never faced across a room, never given the dignity of a confrontation. That was not necessary, and she did not want it. What happened to him happened the way the collapse of a mine happens once its supports are cut, slowly and then all at once. The investigation into the Lucky Strike opened the question of how a smelter man had come to consolidate half a ridge of failed claims. And that question opened others. And once Pell's men began to read the record of Calloway's acquisitions with the carved wall in mind, the pattern showed itself the way the saw kerf had shown itself once the rubble was cleared. The foundation of paper on which Royce Calloway had built his standing in the valley turned out to be founded in more places than one, on claims whose owners had met sudden ends or sudden ruin. A string of failures and deaths that no single man had ever set side by side until now. He was a man who had done his work through documents, and in the end, it was documents that undid him. The careful record of his own acquisitions, read at last by men who knew what they were looking at. There was talk that the territory would bring a charge, and talk that other families would bring their own. And under the weight of that talk, the soft, reasonable voice fell silent. He left Cobre before the worst of it came down, sold what he could quietly, and was gone one morning before the town was awake. Where he went, Della never troubled to learn. He simply became irrelevant, the way a man becomes irrelevant when the thing he built on is shown to be hollow. The mountain he had brought down to keep a secret had kept the secret only until the right hand came to dig it out. The valley shifted slowly after that, the way valleys do. The men who had laughed at the woman who bought a grave for $1 did not come to her with apologies, because that is not how such men are made. But the laughing stopped, and in the stopping there was a kind of acknowledgement that was worth more than any apology. The clerk who had told her she had bought herself a grave with a door on it saw her in the street some months later and took off his hat and said nothing, and that was enough. She did not say, "I told you so." The carved stone in the mountain had said it for her in a dead man's hand, and there was nothing she could add to that. Eli Mercer was buried proper at last in the cemetery at Cabra, under a stone that Della paid for out of the first true money the Lucky Strike ever made, because the vein as he had carved was true. She worked it herself, with Asa Webb beside her, and in time with other hands, she hired and paid fairly, and it was never a great mine and never made her rich in the way the valley measured riches. But it was honest ground, worked honestly, and it gave back what such ground gives to those who tend it with care. She used the first of it to settle Eli's small debts in the town, the ones Calloway had let stand against his name to blacken it, walking from the mercantile to the assay office to the livery, and paying each one out and asking for the paper marked clear, so that no scrap remained anywhere that called Eli Mercer a man who did not pay what he owed. She put the stone over his grave with his name and his dates, and a single line beneath them that she chose herself, that he had worked his ground in truth. And she paid Asa Webb what a powder man's testimony and a powder man's labor were worth, which the old man took with a gruffness that did not hide what it meant to him, and he used some of it to mend the roof of the stone hut at the foot of the ridge, the roof he had once been afraid would come down on him for speaking, and he lived under it, sound and easy for the rest of his days, and came up the trail most mornings to work beside her until his hands would no longer let him. There was a granddaughter of Eli's, it turned out, a young woman named Ruth, who had been raised back east, believing her grandfather a failed and dishonest prospector, who had died broke in a hole of his own foolishness, because that was the story Calloway's reach had carried even that far. The easy story that a ruined man is a foolish one. Della wrote to her, a plain letter that said only that she had owned the Lucky Strike, and that the things Ruth had been told were not true, and that there was something in the mountain the young woman ought to see for herself. In time, Ruth came west, a slight grave woman with her grandfather's stillness in her, and Della took her up the ridge and down into the shaft she had reopened, along the new timber and past the place where Eli had been found, all the way to the deepest part of the stope. She held the lamp up to the letters and stood back and said nothing, and let the young woman read in her grandfather's own cutting that he had been neither failed nor dishonest nor foolish, but a man who had held his ground and told the truth and paid for it, and had reached forward across his own death to set it right. Ruth put her hand on the carved name the way Della had, tracing it, and she wept where Della had not, and Della let her, and held the lamp steady, because that was a grief that had earned its weeping, and the holding of the lamp was the kindest thing she had to give. They climbed out together into the light, and Ruth carried up with her the knowledge that the name she bore was a clean one, which was worth more to her than the half-share Della pressed on her, and which she at first refused. What Della kept in the end was not the gold, though there was enough of that for an honest life. What she kept was her father's lesson, proven now in the deepest way a lesson can be proven. Listen to the ground first. The ground does not lie, even when men do. She had bought a collapsed mine for $1 because a dead man had trusted her to read what the living would not, and she had gone down into the dark and brought up the truth with her own hands, and the truth had done the rest. There was no shout in it, and no gunfire, and no moment of triumph in a crowded street. There was only the long, patient labor of a woman who would not be hurried, and a name cut deep in stone by a man who knew that stone keeps what paper cannot, and the slow settling of a weight into the place where it belonged. She kept her father's tools cleaned and oiled on a shelf by the door of the small house she built near the mine, the single jack hammer and the steel, and the candle holder she had carried out of the dark, Eli's tools beside her father's, 2 old miner's kits kept by a woman who had learned from both. On winter evenings, when the work was done and the lamp was lit and the wind worked at the eaves, she would sometimes take down the worn hammer her father had taught her with, the handle smoothed by his hand and then by hers, and hold it a while, and feel in the weight of it the whole of what she had been given and what she had done with it. The carved wall still stood in the deep of the mountain, the name and the words cut into it as deep as the day a dying man had cut them, and she left it there, untouched, the truest title she would ever hold. The ground had not lied. It had only waited, the way the patient and the true will wait, for a hand that would listen and dig and bring the buried thing at last into the light. If you had owned $1 and a dead man's trust, would you have gone down into that dark to find what the mountain was hiding? I would like to know. And if this story sat with you the way the best of them do, there is another I think you ought to hear, about a woman and a sealed wagon and the long road that brought the truth of it home.